Eisenhower trusted Patton with speed, with aggression, with victories no one else could deliver. But there was one thing Eisenhower never said out loud, something he only admitted behind closed doors, because if the wrong people heard it, Patton's career would be finished. This wasn't about the Germans. It wasn't about losing a battle. It was about what Patton might do next. There came a moment when Patton crossed a line, not on the battlefield, but in judgment. Eisenhower didn't shout. He didn't punish him immediately. He paused. And in that pause was a decision that could remove the most dangerous general in the Allied Army. What Eisenhower feared in that moment was defeat. It was victory at the wrong cost. And once you understand what he said in private, you'll understand why Patton was never quite the same after. In the autumn of 1919, on the grounds of Camp Meade in Maryland, two young officers met for the first time. Neither man knew it then, but this chance encounter would shape the destiny of millions. Their friendship would become legendary. Their conflicts would become infamous. And by the time the Second World War ended, their relationship would hold the key to understanding how America won in European Euro and why some victories came at the cost of broken trust. This is the story of Dwight David Eisenhower and George Smith Patton Jr., but more importantly, it's the story of what Eisenhower feared most. And it wasn't Nazi Germany. It was Patton himself. To understand how one man could frighten the supreme commander, we need to go back to the beginning. To understand the fear, we need to understand the friendship. In the years after World War I, the United States Army was in chaos. Soldiers were being demobilized by the hundreds of thousands. Budgets were slashed. Officers who had commanded armies were suddenly reduced in rank, struggling to support their families on crumbling military pay. Many left the service altogether. But two men refused to give up. Dwight Eisenhower came from nothing. He was born in Denison, Texas, in a family that struggled for every dollar. His father worked in a creamery. Young Ike worked night shifts to put himself through high school. Everything he achieved, he earned through relentless discipline and quiet competence. He was self-effacing. He smiled easily. People liked him immediately. He had the kind of presence that made others comfortable, that inspired confidence without demanding it. George Patton came from everything. His family was old Money-Euro California aristocracy. His ancestors were military officers. His grandfather was a general. George Patton was born believing he was destined for greatness. He dressed as he pleased. He spoke without filter. He cursed like a trooper. He intimidated people with a practiced scowl, and he expected the world to acknowledge his superiority. Where Eisenhower earned respect quietly, Patton demanded it loudly. By every measure, these two men should have been enemies. They should have clashed immediately and irrevocably. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Both men were obsessed with tanks. This was unusual. Most of the Army leadership dismissed tanks as a novelty euro, a temporary weapon useful only for breaking through trenches. But Eisenhower and Patton saw something the others didn't. They saw the future. They saw mechanized warfare. They saw speed, firepower, and mobility combine into a devastating force. The two men took to meeting regularly. They would discuss military theory for hours. Patton would sketch ideas on paper. Eisenhower would counter with questions. They were passionate in a way that bordered on religious fervor. To them, tanks weren't just weapons. They were the key to winning the next war euro whenever and wherever it came. They wrote articles together. They experimented with tactics. They pushed against the rigid orthodoxy of the old guard generals who still thought in terms of trenches and static defense. Years later, Eisenhower would write about this period. From the beginning, he and I got along famously. Both of us were students of current military doctrine, and both of us were convinced that the next war would be a war of movement. This friendship became one of the most important military relationships in American history. And yet, it would also become the source of profound tension and fear. The fear crept in slowly. It didn't arrive all at once. It grew with each passing year, with each new crisis, with each moment that Patton's brilliance was matched only by his recklessness. To understand this fear, you have to understand what made George Patton terrifying to Dwight Eisenhower. It wasn't Patton's military incompetence. It was his genius. It wasn't his weakness. It was a strength of Euro uncontrolled, unpredictable, and utterly unleashed. When World War II erupted in Europe, Eisenhower was serving as a staff officer in relatively obscurity. Patton was already building a reputation as a warrior king, drilling his troops into a frenzy of military readiness. But Eisenhower had political acumen that Patton lacked. He understood how to navigate the Byzantine bureaucracy of the War Department. He understood that war wasn't won by generals alone in Euro. It was won by commanders who could work with politicians, diplomats, and other military services. When Eisenhower was tapped to lead the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch, he immediately thought of Patton. He needed aggressive commanders. He needed men who could move fast, think faster, and strike with overwhelming force. Patton was exactly that man. But even as Eisenhower elevated his old friend, he must have felt a tremor of anxiety. He was putting an enormous amount of power in the hands of a man who didn't always listen to authority, a man who believed he was destined for greatness, a man who wouldn't take no for an answer. The first crisis came almost immediately. In Tunisia, Patton's II Corps was struggling against veteran German forces. Morale was low. The troops were demoralized. Eisenhower sent Patton to take command, and what happened next was vintage Patton. He issued orders that seemed insane. He demanded that every man spit shine his boots, even in the middle of the desert. He required that every vehicle be painted in perfect order. He stood on hills with his ivory-handled pistols on display, daring the enemy to shoot him. His troops thought he was mad. But within weeks, the transformation was complete. II Corps went from a demoralized rabble to one of the most fearsome fighting forces in North Africa. Eisenhower watched this transformation with a mixture of admiration and dread. Admiration because he recognized military genius when he saw it. Dread because he understood what came with it. Patton was becoming a war hero. Newspapers were writing about him. Soldiers were talking about him. The public was hearing his name. And with that fame came something far more dangerous than military incompetence. It came with influence, with followers, with a personality so outsized that it couldn't be contained or controlled. The crisis that would define their relationship came in Sicily during Operation Husky in 1943. Patton's 7th Army was racing across the island, destroying everything in its path. He was moving so fast that his supply lines couldn't keep up. He was taking territory that political planners said he shouldn't take. And then, in a moment that would haunt both men for years, Patton made a decision that terrified Eisenhower. On August 3, 1943, Patton visited a hospital full of wounded soldiers. As he walked through the wards, he encountered a young private who had no visible wounds. The soldier was suffering from what was then called shell shock in Euro, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The soldier was crying. Patton, who believed that courage came from will and discipline, and that weakness was a personal failure, snapped. He slapped the man across the face. He called him a coward. He pulled his pistolero, one of those ivory-handled weapons that had become his signature at Euro, and said things that the official records won't fully repeat. But that amounted to threatening the man's life if he didn't straighten up. Word of this incident spread like wildfire through the army. Reporters got hold of it. Congressmen heard about it. There were calls for Patton to be court-martialed. There were demands that he be sent home in disgrace. And Eisenhower faced a decision that would define his command. What do you do when your most brilliant general becomes a liability? When his genius comes packaged with personalities so volatile that he threatens to destroy the war effort? Eisenhower could have ended Patton's career. It would have been politically safer. It would have satisfied the critics. It would have removed the problem from his hands. But instead, Eisenhower made a choice that revealed the depth of his understanding about war. He recognized that firing Patton wouldn't eliminate the problem. It would simply create a martyr. It would hand Patton's considerable political influence to his enemies. And more importantly, it would remove from a battlefield the one general who could execute the kind of aggressive, fast-moving warfare that Eisenhower knew would be necessary to win the war. So Eisenhower did something far more subtle and far more complex. He didn't punish Patton. He contained him. He had Patton issue a careful apology. He gave him specific orders about his conduct, and then he kept him on a very short leash, monitoring his every move, ready to pull him back at any moment. This became the pattern of their relationship for the rest of the war. Eisenhower would unleash Patton when he needed that particular brand of military genius, and Patton would deliver results that no other general could match. But Eisenhower would always be watching, always waiting for the next explosion, always afraid of what his most brilliant general might do next. The fear intensified during the Normandy campaign. D-Day itself was a masterpiece of coordination and planning, and Patton was held back, relegated to a reserve role. This infuriated him. He belly evaded Euro, probably correctly Euro, that he should be leading the main assault. But Eisenhower had learned his lesson. He wasn't going to give Patton that much freedom until he absolutely had to. When Patton finally broke out of Normandy and began his famous sweep across France, Eisenhower had to make calculation after calculation. How much rope could he give Patton? How far could he let him run? How much insubordination could he tolerate in pursuit of victory? What made this so psychologically taxing for Eisenhower was that Patton kept delivering. His Third Army covered ground at a pace that seemed impossible. He moved faster than logistics, faster than intelligence, faster than anyone thought possible. He would capture cities that headquarters didn't even know were under threat. He would break out of encirclements and turn them into offensives. He would find weaknesses in the German lines and exploit them with devastating speed. By any military standard, he was exactly what the war effort needed. But the fear never went away. The fear that Patton would go too far. The fear that he would take territory that had political consequences. The fear that he would ignore direct orders. The fear that his outsized personality would create a political crisis that would undermine Eisenhower's authority as supreme commander. The fear that Patton might begin to see himself as answerable not to Eisenhower, but to some higher Kalindi Euro, to destiny, to history, to his own image of himself as a warrior destined for greatness. And Eisenhower wasn't wrong to be afraid, because Patton did have that belief. Patton kept a diary. In that diary, he wrote things that would have been absolutely catastrophic if they had become public. He wrote about believing that he and Eisenhower had been reincarnated military leaders from history. He wrote about viewing this war as his moment, his destiny, his place in the annals of military greatness. He wrote about conflict with Eisenhower in terms that suggested he didn't fully accept Eisenhower's authority. He wrote about the war in ways that made it clear he was thinking about more than just winning. He was thinking about his place in history. The final crisis came near the end of the war in Europe, and it revealed the true depth of Eisenhower's fear. Soviet forces were closing in from the east. Western forces were closing in from the west. The question of who would reach certain objectives first to Euro, particularly Berlin and other major cities Euro, was becoming a matter of intense military and political importance. Patton wanted to make a dash for Berlin. He wanted to beat the Soviets to it. He wanted the glory of capturing the German capital. Eisenhower explicitly forbade it. He issued direct orders that Patton was not to advance beyond a certain line. And here was the moment of truth. Here was the test of whether Eisenhower's fear was justified, because Patton, for just a moment, seemed to hesitate. For just a moment, it seemed like he might disobey that direct order. For just a moment, it seemed like his belief in his own destiny might overcome his military discipline. But he didn't. Patton accepted the order. He turned his army around. He accepted the constraints that Eisenhower placed on him. The fear that had haunted Eisenhower Euro, that Patton would become uncontrollable, that his brilliance would tip over into mutiny Euro, never fully came to pass. But it came close enough that both men understood the danger that had always lurked between them. After the war, their relationship deteriorated rapidly. Patton was given command of occupation forces in Bavaria. Almost immediately, he began making controversial statements about the nature of the Nazi Party, suggesting that some Nazis weren't as bad as people thought. He gave interviews that seemed to suggest sympathy for the Nazi cause. He removed denazification officers and replaced them with people he trusted. He attempted to keep the Wehrmacht and SS generals in positions of influence to maintain order. Eisenhower had to remove him, had to publicly humiliate him, had to essentially exile him from the center of power. And for Patton, it was devastating. He had won the war. He had been one of the greatest military commanders of the 20th century, and yet he was being punished, cast aside, his moment in the sun ending in disgrace. Patton died in a car accident in December 1945, just months after the war ended. Some have speculated about the circumstances. Some have suggested that it was more than an accident, but the truth is more prosaic and more tragic. Patton simply got into a car, and that car hit another vehicle, and Patton died from injuries that would have been survivable if he had received immediate medical care. He was replaced in the car by another officer, and that officer survived. Patton died essentially alone on a German road, far from home, his moment of glory already fading into history. Eisenhower's response was complex. He attended Patton's funeral. He wept, and then he moved on. He returned to America. He became president. He spent the rest of his life managing the Cold War, making decisions that would shape the world. And occasionally, he would reflect on Patton, on what Patton had been, on what Patton could have done, on what Patton represented. In his memoirs, Eisenhower wrote about Patton with genuine affection, but also with a clear-eyed assessment. He recognized Patton's genius. He also recognized his danger. He understood that in war, sometimes you need men who can't be fully controlled. Sometimes you need to take risks with brilliant people. Sometimes the fear you feel about someone's capacity for destruction is the very thing that makes them valuable in a desperate situation. But Eisenhower never lost that fear. Even after Patton's death, even after the war was won, even after history had rendered its judgment a euro, that Patton was one of the great generals of the 20th century, Eisenhower understood something that most people missed. War required not just brilliant generals. War required brilliant generals who could be controlled, who understood the limits of their own authority, who recognized that military force was an instrument of national policy, not an end in itself. Patton never fully accepted those limits. He always believed that he knew better. He always believed that his way was the right way. He always believed that his destiny was his to claim, that history would vindicate him, that the rules that bound ordinary men didn't apply to him. And Eisenhower spent years managing that belief, containing it, channeling it, preventing it from exploding into something catastrophic. What Eisenhower feared most wasn't Germany. It wasn't Hitler. It wasn't Soviet expansion or Japanese militarism or any of the conventional threats that a military commander has to contend with. What Eisenhower feared most was the possibility that his greatest ally would become his greatest problem, that the general he needed most was the one he could trust the least, that genius and danger came in the same package, and that once you open that package, you could never quite put it back together again. This fear turned out to be prophetic, because after the war, when Patton was no longer needed for military victory, when his genius was no longer an asset, but a potential liability, Eisenhower had to sever the relationship, had to remove his old friend from power, had to essentially banish him from the circles that mattered. And Patton, who had been so essential to victory, found himself cast aside, his legacy already being written in ways he didn't like, his influence already being dismissed. The relationship between Eisenhower and Patton was one of the most important military relationships in history. But it was also a relationship defined by fear. Fear that was never fully resolved. Fear that was justified by events. Fear that revealed something essential about the nature of power, genius, and control in military organizations. In the end, Eisenhower won the war. But the victory came at a cost that most people don't fully recognize. It came at the cost of managing a relationship with a brilliant but dangerous man. It came at the cost of years of anxiety and tension and careful calculation. It came at the cost of having to make decisions that required both trusting Patton with enormous responsibilities and never fully trusting him with the freedom to make his own choices. And that, perhaps more than any other aspect of Eisenhower's generalship, reveals why he was a great military commander, not because he had all the answers, not because he made no mistakes, but because he understood something essential, that the hardest part of leadership isn't making decisions about tactics or strategy. The hardest part is managing people, managing brilliant people, managing dangerous people, managing the people you need most but can trust the least. Patton understood strategy and tactics better than almost any general who ever lived. But Eisenhower understood something that Patton never quite grasped. He understood that war is ultimately about more than military victory. It's about achieving objectives within a political context. It's about subordinating military force to civilian control. It's about recognizing that genius is valuable, but only if it can be controlled and directed toward legitimate ends. What Eisenhower feared most wasn't Germany. It was the possibility that his best general would teach him a euro and the world a euro, that lesson in a way that nobody wanted to learn. And in the end, through careful management and political acumen and a willingness to do difficult things, Eisenhower made sure that Patton's brilliance served the war effort, rather than threatening to undermine it. He kept the fear in check. He contained the danger. And he guided the country to victory. But the cost of that victory, in terms of the personal relationship between these two men, was high. Their friendship survived the war, but it was never the same. Their trust, once broken by crises and conflicts, was never fully restored. And when Patton died, Eisenhower lost not just a military colleague, but a reminder of something he had worked so hard to manage and control throughout the entire war. What Eisenhower feared most was Patton. And in the end, that fear shaped the very victory they fought so hard to achieve together.